Dr. Lia Shimada, who will take us through a fascinating discussion around faith, migration, community. Lia is a London-based mediator and community practitioner with extensive experience in the not-for-profit sector. Lia was born in Seattle, and she left the Pacific Northwest for New England to study English literature and environmental sciences at Wellesley. In 2000, she received a fellowship from the Watson Foundation to work with reforestation movements in Nepal, Madagascar, and Ireland, on both sides of the border. There was romance in Belfast, and eventually she made her way here. In Northern Ireland, Lia moved through the 10th anniversary of the peace accords, worked with the grassroots peace building process, specializing in conflict transformation and regeneration in communities with a strong paramilitary presence. Lia also held a remit for the diversity outreach and hate crime prevention. And this is something that is quite of interest to the work that we do with the Interfaith Forum. We recently launched a project called Safe Haven that deals exactly with those issues here. Anyway, moving on. In London, Lia implemented the National Diversity Strategy for the British Methodist Church and served as a community mediator in multicultural East London. She's particularly interested in the relationship between conflict, resilience, and diversity in faith communities. As an accredited mediator, registered with the National College of Mediators, Lia works primarily with organizational, workplace, community, and housing disputes. In 2016, she was appointed to the Professional Standards Committee. She chairs the working group responsible for developing and implementing the policy for diversity and inclusive practice in mediation. Lia holds a doctorate in geography from University College London and the master's in theology from religious studies from King's College in London. She has extensive experience with coordinating participatory research projects where the participants themselves shape the questions and the process of the research. This morning, we're, like I said, privileged as she'll take us through her book, Mapping Faith, Theologies of Migration and Community. And we'll be fortunate, I guess, to have a discussion and share some thoughts on these concepts that are very dear to us, to the work that we do. So without further ado, Lia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Adrian. And I just want to say that this is a bit of a homecoming for me. I don't know if you caught in the biography that I spent some time living in Ireland. Most of that time was spent in Belfast. A number of years I spent living and working there, but I did spend 3 months living in Dublin right out of university. So I have really fond memories of the city, and I was delighted when Sheila invited me to come speak with you today. So we are going to be spending some time talking today about this book, Mapping Faith, Theologies of Migration and Theologies of Migration and Community. And if you just bear with me 1 second, I'm just going to pull some slides up for you. Are you able to see this?
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. So what I'd like you to do initially is just to take you through the story of how this book came into being. And then what I'll do is I'll say a bit about how I have envisioned structuring our time together, and then we'll take it from there. But I'd like to say from the outset that this will be not just me speaking to you. I've punctuated our time together with a lot of opportunities for us to have discussion throughout the 90 minutes we have together. So I really am looking forward to hearing your insights and reflections as well. So about this book, the seed for this project was planted during an alternative pilgrimage that I did to Israel-Palestine in 2013. And particularly when I visited the town of Hebron in the West Bank. Some of you may have been there as well. In Hebron is a place that is known by many names, just one of which is the Tomb of the Patriarchs. This is believed to be the burial site of Abraham and Sarah, of Isaac and Rebekah, and Jacob and Leah. It's a family tomb and a holy site shared by multiple religions. So as both a geographer and a theologian, I was just really fascinated by this place. Just a few photos just to give you some context. This is the contemporary situation in Hebron. Lots of barbed wire, lots of military presence, and a picture of the tomb itself, which is really vast. So as both a geographer and a theologian, I just thought this place was utterly fascinating, and I just kept thinking about it long after I'd left that place. A few years later, I was approached by a publisher to write a book about migration and theology. And I kept returning to my memories of Hebron and of the three so-called largest Abrahamic traditions that share that site. And I realized that what I wanted to produce was a book that brings different religious perspectives into dialogue with each other. So what seemed feasible in terms of securing a publishing contract was a book that would bring Jewish, Christian, and Muslim voices into dialogue with each other. There's some very academic work around this, and there's some very practical work around this, but I really thought that what was missing was something that looked specifically at migration and theology, and that could be read and shared and discussed by I think a broad readership. That was really a passion of mine, was to make sure that this is something that was going to be genuinely used, this book. I'd like to say a quick note about the Abrahamic religions. I want to say first off that although Judaism and Christianity and Islam are the largest, they are by no means the only that fall within this family of religions, as I'm sure within your forum you're very aware. I've just come up with a very, sorry about this, very quick list, and I'm sure there are many more. But I will say that every book project does need to be bounded somehow, and we kind of, through negotiations with the publisher, what we settled on is a book that would focus on Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. I very much hope that another editor will produce a different book in the very near future. I hope that another book project along similar themes would draw from different faith traditions, and in so doing, it would enable us to widen this dialogue. So if you know of anyone who's interested in doing that, please do encourage them. So I'll just come out of screen share just so I can talk to you directly for a bit more. So what I really wanted to do was to create a book that ordinary people would read. In other words, a book that would feel much more at home in a book group than in a university library. And in fact, as Sheila can attest, the briefing that I gave to every contributor to this project was to imagine that you are communicating with a book group that meets within a faith tradition that is not your own. So actually pausing to reflect, to think how you want to describe something or explain something, and to think about the assumptions that we make in terms of what is considered common knowledge from our own religious perspectives. And I very much wanted to learn personally in the process of producing this book. So the questions that I was carrying with me were, what is migration? How do we understand the presence of God in people on the move? How does faith shape migration and vice versa? How does migration shape our understanding of community in the context of faith? And above all, what might I learn about my own faith tradition through the process of walking alongside other people as they grappled with similar questions? Once the book contract was in place, which took quite a few months, I then went to work. From the beginning, I knew that I wanted to commission an even spread of voices across the three faith traditions that are represented in this book. And to the extent possible, I wanted to commission a range of perspectives within each of those traditions. Being London-based, it's very easy to get a little bit lazy and to just choose people who are based in London. But I really wanted to select a broad balance in terms of gender, age, and also geography. So even though the contributors are primarily kind of from this corner of the world, they're not just within London or just within England. And I was really delighted when my commissioning editor at the publisher put me in touch with Sheila. It was really lovely to have that connection with Ireland as well. And I wanted to commission different types of contributions. So obviously this book has a lot of essays, but I was also really passionate about including poetry and art as well. So I'm just going to come back into screen sharing for a second. Let's see. Slide. Okay, so what came into being was this book. It brings together over 35 contributors, including Sheila, of course. These are writers, poets, artists, and practitioners, and they come from a broad range of Jewish, Muslim, and Christian backgrounds. As I was putting together the material, I realized that what was happening was that it was falling into place kind of within three broad themes, and these became the formal themes of the book itself. So the first of these themes is faith encounters. By this, I mean not just encountering other faith traditions, but also encountering new ways of reflecting within your own faith as well. We looked at sacred texts. This is probably the largest of the sections within the book. And I also looked at diaspora. I think this was a really important theme that has a lot of both historic and contemporary resonance. So obviously there is loads of cross-pollination between each of these themes, but putting it together really felt like it was the right shape for this particular project. So within each of these three sections, there are approximately 7 essays, plus contributions from 2 poets, as well as images and reflections from a visual artist. And today we'll be looking at the contributions from 2 of those 3 artists. Sheila also mentioned that this particular group would be interested in knowing who else was contributing from the island of Ireland. So in addition to Sheila, we also have Padraig O'Tuama, who is Belfast-based poet. Until very recently, he was the leader of the Coramila community based in Belfast, but also they have a site on the North Coast. And also Katie Radford, who is a former colleague of mine from when I was working in Belfast. So I was really delighted that we were able to cross the Irish Sea and have some really substantial contributions to this project from people in your part of the world as well. One final thing that I'd like to say is that inevitably the book is going to reflect my own interests and curiosity as the editor. This is one of the great perks of editing a project like this. So hence the number of contributions that explore these themes from, say, a feminist perspective or through the voices of migrants and refugees themselves. And as I said earlier, I do hope that another editor comes along and produces another book on migration and theology and community and finds another set of contributors, because I'd be really curious to see how these different perspectives interweave. The book was published in June by Jessica Kingsley Publishers, which is an imprint of Hachette. Due to the pandemic, this was a kind of another casualty, although a very, very minor one. The publisher decided to delay release of the physical copies of the book until next month. So they've all been printed, they're hanging out in a warehouse, and they will be released for sale on the 21st of December. In the meantime, the electronic version is currently available through a variety of distributors, although the publisher is offering a 25% discount for any copies purchased directly from their website. And after the session, I'd be happy to circulate the code. Maybe I'll send it via Adrian so he could send it to you, if you're interested. Very final thing to say about the book is that all proceeds will be donated to the Helen Bamber Foundation. This is a London-based charity that works with migrants who have suffered from human cruelty, including trafficking and torture. They do really amazing work, and I'm just thrilled that we're able to support it, even just a little bit, by funneling the proceeds of this book to them. So we'll have some time at the end of the session to talk about the book more generally, if you have any questions about it. But I think what I'd like to do now is just to take you through a bit about what I'd like to do with this time. So we've talked about the story of the book and how it came into being. I'm just checking my time to see how I'm doing. I'm going to start with looking at the first section, which is about faith encounters through one particular piece of art. Sheila's going to talk to the second section of the book on sacred texts. And then I'll finish up by talking about the theme of diaspora, again, through the lens of one of the artists who contributed. So with that, let's get going. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put an image on the screen, and you can look at it while I tell you a bit about the artist, and then I'll read a short extract from his or her chapter. And then after that, I'll turn off the screen share and we can have a brief discussion. I'm also going to pop a few reflection questions into the chat space for you to think about in the moment or take away later if you prefer. So the first image that I'd like to talk about is actually not this one. This is one of the two images that I commissioned from a map maker named Catherine Baxter. And this one eventually became the cover of the book. Catherine is an illustrator and a map maker. She's based in London. She happens to be a Methodist lay preacher based at Wesley's Chapel on City Road. And she receives commissions from around the world to do maps, and I was really thrilled and delighted that she was willing to put some of her considerable talent toward this project. So this is actually the image that I'd like us to be reflecting on today. I gave her a really difficult brief. In addition to saying, I would love you to make a map of Abraham's journey, I also said, for the second piece of art, would you please produce a map that somehow captures some of the holy sites from all three of the traditions that we explore in the book. It's a really vast area. There's a reason why you rarely see these places appear on one map, but she put her mind to it and realized that if she kind of took the perspective that you see, she could stretch, she could kind of visualize the curve of the earth, and therefore that helped her to visualize how she put this map together. She's also, being a map maker, very keen on borders, and her maps always include a border. You'll notice that there's a very strong one, but it's disrupted by the boat and the plane and the compass coming through. So what I'd like to do now is read a bit of the text from her chapter. This is one I interviewed her, and we put it together kind of collaboratively from the recording of our interview. So Catherine says, maps tell a story. To see migration geographically, to have a visual picture of movements from one land to the other, suddenly everything is put into context. It's visual language. You can easily say he went from one land to the other. You can write that, but to draw it is to orientate people. Then she talks a bit about the parallels between preaching and map making, and she writes about being commissioned to create a map that depicted the life story of a Holocaust survivor. And she finishes her chapter by talking about visual theology, which is where I want to pick up. I once preached a sermon based on one by Martin Luther King Jr. about having a three-dimensional life. We can go through life in a two-dimensional way, pretending everything is fine. But it's only when we have darkness and shadow that our lives become fuller. I've never liked the idea of the suffering Christ on the cross. But darkness, not suffering, is needed to shape people and to make them who they are. It is how we get through the darkness, how we live it, that makes our lives three-dimensional. All of my pictures are three-dimensional. As soon as I put shadows in, as soon as I do tones and darkness, as soon as I look at the light of a drawing, it becomes something else. The picture comes up and out of the page. It's visual theology. Okay, I'm going to come out of screen share, and Adrian's going to just kick off the discussion while I put a few questions into the chat space.
Thank you, Lia. I think we're off the start of a very interesting session, and when I saw the pictures of Hebron there, it certainly brought back memories. I don't think anyone can go to Hebron without coming back transformed in one way or the other. Particularly if you step in and visit the Al-Ibrahimi Mosque. From our own perspective, it was interesting. We brought a few young people with us from our own youth board, and we had the opportunity to say a prayer in the mosque. So it was interesting having a corner of the mosque. There was a group of Christians praying. In the other corner, a group of Muslims praying. And our young people were leading the prayers. The young Muslims were leading the prayers in their corner, and we were leading the prayers. So that had a huge effect upon us. All in the middle of heavy military presence, barbed wire, gates, iron gates, locked, everything, people queuing to move from one corner to another of the city. And yet everybody was very welcoming. Everybody was friendly and happy to talk to people.
Wonderful.
So
I was going to say thank you for that, because it's really great to hear another perspective of being in that place. And actually, I was thinking as you were talking, it might make sense to begin this conversation with the second question that I had to put in the chat space, which I think springs directly out of the story that Adrian was telling about that lovely moment of sharing a prayer space. So why don't we start there for lack of any other place? How does that map resonate with or challenge your understanding of this idea of holy lands?
I suppose for me, the immediate thing, I just remind people they might need to unmute themselves if they want to contribute. Is just seeing it all in one piece, because I grew up in a tradition of things, the Holy Land in relation to the Bible, and the communities associated with that. But to see the whole thing in that compression, which also looked familiar. It was strange but familiar. Yeah, it just resonated in terms of what Adrian has been saying. And I mean, again, because of COVID, we've had for the last maybe 3 years, Adrian, we've had a group coming from Jerusalem, a Muslim, Christian and Jewish young people have come to Dublin every year for the last 2 or 3 years to talk. So, but again, with just when you saw the map, you just saw a whole integration of all of those traditions together.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, for me, the thing is that how maps change and reformulate. And, you know, that they're political persuasions, because when you look at what happened in 1947, you know, or whatever, that how the bounds of any mapping reorientates our mind, because they change and they create borders and they become political onsets. So when you put that map together, it's a very different mapping than the mapping that is there, and the consternations that when we move and shape territories differently, it takes the mindset into a whole other way of thinking and being. And no more than what Adrian was saying, you know, when I visited the Holy Lands and coming from a country that is divided itself and living, you know, coming out of a border town, because I'm from Donegal, originally from Letterkenny, and growing up crossing a border to go anywhere, what it does to your mindset and how it creates a mindset of walls and discrimination, until you realize when you look above all of that, that there are no borders. but that the remapping and organizing, you know, that was the thing that fascinated me when I got the book, to see how you rewrite a map differently can shape thinking differently.
It looks as though there's a comment that's just come through. It looks as though you were not talking about migration in general. It is more of Abrahamic faiths migration of other religions and communities. Would you like to expound on that?
Dr. Puri. So I might just ask Dr. Puri to unmute.
Yeah, I unmuted it. You know, just it is, you know, she's talking of the migration and communities. I would like to know the definition of the migration. Is it the migration only limited to Abrahamic faiths, or communities are only them? There are other religions in the world. They have also suffered the persecutions, like the Sikhs have been persecuted by Mughal regime, and like Sikhs took a task with them, along with the Muslims on their side, to fight against the tyranny of the Muslims there. And Sikhs have migrated all over the world. Even in today's world, Sikhs have been targeted as Muslims, and they have been targeted with a full, you know, like in America, so many people have been killed. They have attacked our Gurdwara. But when you're talking of the migration, migration is of the communities. It's a human nature to migrate from one corner to another corner. While if you check the Abrahamic faith, the migration was only during that time. Now, how the religions come up, they come up with their own, you know, like from one religion to another, reforms occur. But is it through persuasion or is it through force? You know, these things occur, you know,
yeah,
these things occur.
And I'm really glad you've expanded this dialogue. As I said in the introduction, for this particular project, what I was hoping to do was to help us think about theology and migration in its broadest sense. But as with any book project, you need a particular lens to look at it through. So for this particular book, that lens is looking through not just the Abrahamic faiths, but actually just a specific three of those. So you know, as I said, I'm really hoping that this is just the beginning of a conversation, and that other people will come along and say, we need to expand this conversation even further. This book was a good initial springboard. I'm going to write another book and bring even more faith traditions in.
Yeah, you know what my argument was, I'm saying what without any prejudice with anybody, because most of the religions tell us about the humanity and the migration. In journal, if you write, it will give you, I'm trying to give you another topic so that you can write about the migration only. You know, how migration occurs, not on the faith lines. It could be economic terms. It could be just to, as a adventure, to look up the different part of the world. You know, the migration occurs because of many things, you know.
Well, I think you should be the next person to write the next book. I would love to read the book that you put together.
I think to be fair,
I can't write. I can't write.
I think we have time for one. I think we have time for one more comment or reflection before we move to Sheila's thoughts on sacred text.
It's really just a follow to Dr. Puri there. I think the book is this book about this perspective, about this particular starting point, and we did have a bit of discussion. Our Lia explained that at the start before you joined. But I do think what we have to be able to capture in these things is both the generalities and the commonalities, but also the particularities of stories and histories.
Yes.
So there is obviously a book and an interfaith book to be written about the Indian subcontinent and what's happened there. And this book is about a particular set of themes. But I think it's all of us together will paint the picture.
We are all together. I'm not saying that, but I'm just pointing what I listened to it, you know, that there should be in a wider perspective, you know.
Absolutely, yes.
I'm not, my apologies for anything if you feel in that way.
I'm not a writer
at all, you know.
It's good to be reminded all the time that this is just one entry point into this much wider dialogue. I think actually what I'd like to do is turn it over to Sheila now. I think she has some slides. As I said, when I was putting the book together, the sacred text section was actually the section that came together first. Just a combination of the contributors that joined and also what they wanted to write about. Sheila was one of the first contributors that came on board, and her chapter actually is right in the middle of the book. I put it right in the center of the section. So I'm really, really looking forward to hearing what she has to say. Thank you, Sheila.
Thank you very much, Lia. And, you know, as even Dr. Purian that's setting out, is you write from your own context, and you write from a particular context, and sacred texts are that challenge. Each of us read our sacred text from the context to which we come out of. And I'm writing as a white woman, as a Catholic white woman, looking at a particular text from a particular type of interpretation of theology. Michael, next slide. So I'm looking at this text through a feminist, liberationist methodology that is constructed by a theologian by the name of Elizabeth Schüssler Fiorenza, who teaches in Harvard, and she's quite well known within the biblical world. And one of her things, particularly because, you know, the Christian Bible, as we understand it, would be that it is mainly a book written by men and for men for the greatest part. And it was only when biblical scholars, women, got an opportunity to study that they began to mind the Bible differently. And through this methodology, one of the things is to start from an everyday life experience, particularly of women, and particularly those that might be from, you know, those voices that are most excluded or oppressed. And the methodology brings into experiences, into dialogue, your experiences with scripture, tradition, and philosophy. And I expand these concepts much more widely in the chapter. But feminist biblical interpretation attempts to create an egalitarian reading, bringing awareness that most of the Bible, as I say, was written and shaped by men. So one of the questions we always bring is, where were the women? What were their experiences? And how are their voices seen and heard? So the text that I focus on, next slide, please, Michael, is a text from Matthew's Gospel, and it is a particular encounter with a woman and Jesus, which is known as the Canaanite woman. And I see this as a borderland story, but also the woman as a prophetic voice within that text. Next slide. And I just thought, for those that are not from the Christian tradition using the gospel, that I would just read the text so that people might get an idea. That Jesus left the place and went away to Tyre, to the district of Tyre and Sidon. Just then, a Canaanite woman from that region came out and started shouting, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is tormented by a demon." But he did not answer her at all. And his disciples came and urged him, saying, "Send her away, for she keeps shouting after us." He answered, "I was only sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But she knelt before him. "Lord, help me." He answered, "It is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." And she said, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table." Then Jesus answered her, "Woman, great is your faith. Let it be done as your wish." And her daughter was healed instantly. So this is quite a controversial text, and it presents Jesus in a particularly different way than people might have imagined this figure of Jesus to be. So next slide. So just taking some of the larger points, as I said, this is done in much more detail in the text. The beginning of the text looks at an encounter between two cultures, because it says the text is located in a particular borderland space. So there was always tension between the Canaanites and the Israelites, and that is historically bounded in different other texts that you would know. But the woman interacts with Jesus despite her ethnic, geographical, or gender orientation. She's not afraid to confront this person. She might represent the outsider or the other, crossing cultural boundaries, seeking healing for her daughter, because it's the need of her daughter that provokes her to look for healing. It is her child being ill that puts her in that position where she'll do anything to get healing for her child. And as a woman, she is proactive. And sometimes we think of women in the biblical world as silent and not proactive. And for this woman, this was a window of an opportunity. It was not just a window of an opportunity, rather she was ensuring that it was the door through which she could walk through. She was going to make sure that her child got healing. But of course, we're all shocked by the reaction that Jesus gave. Like, go away. You know, this is the symbol in the Christian world of a ever healing, ever present, every good person that we always imagine Jesus to be. Yet the way he is seen in this text is not the way we would have expected him to react. And we are absolutely shocked that he does not respond to her initial cry for mercy. Next slide. So in the text, we're confronted with a Jesus that I would say is fully human and culturally biased. Jesus is confronted with his own ethnocentrism. I was only sent to heal the lost sheep of Israel. His words could be interpreted as a racial slur, even hate speech to the woman. It is very aggressive language that he uses in the text. The encounter with the woman was a catalyst that enabled Jesus to see differently and move towards a more inclusive space. Suddenly, in the confrontation with her, Jesus begins to remember who he is and what he is. He may be the Son of Man, fully human, but he is culturally biased. So what does it mean to be the Son of God? If we believe God has no boundaries, no cultural bias. So the Canaanite woman's inner strength and courage transpires for Jesus the universality of God's love and healing. Jesus's mind is changed because in the text, he does say her faith, not his interpretation, but her faith means that her daughter is now healed. So Jesus's mission is enlarged. It's no longer just for the lost sheep of Israel. But we know that mercy has no limits, no boundaries, no geographical space. In the encounter, both borders and boundaries have been crossed by both people, and both people are transformed. Next slide. So conversion means that we're all called beyond ethnocentrism. The reality of today's world urges us to take diversity seriously and to commit ourselves to a new openness to the other, to the stranger. Conversion to an intercultural life and mission demands that we befriend difference and be open to receive the gift that diversity brings in our lives. The Canaanite woman's story shows how even the best of humanity, Jesus himself, can become entangled in systems of oppression and cultural supremacy. We know that mercy needs to be embodied. It's not just an aspiration. Border crossings is not the only task of the newcomer, the migrant or refugees. It demands risk-taking for both those in the host country as well as those that come. We are both demanded to cross our own boundaries, prejudice, borders, constructs, walls, however we perceive them to be. And like Jesus, we are asked to change our perspective, to rethink our theologies, to broaden our minds. Last slide. So in conclusion, and as I said in the text, these are done out much fuller, and this is just a brief overview. The refugee and migrant situation is an opportunity for people of faith to realize our prophetic commitment. There is only one race, the human race. So we're all called to work together to break down the barriers and borders and offer a place of welcome to all. As we know today, people's lives depend on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila. I was really struck, both in the chapter itself, but also hearing you speak just now about that emphasis on borders, which is so clearly relevant in the contemporary situation, both in Ireland, but also in all over the world, and that sense of border crossing being continually something that is everyone's responsibility.
Just following up from previous, I noticed Swami had maybe reference to the previous discussion. You had something in the chat.
Is it okay actually if we stick with this theme of sacred text for the time being, and then pick that up for the general conversation at the end? Is that all right?
Yeah. I just missed the comment, so thank you. Yeah.
Sheila, did you have any particular questions that you wanted to?
My challenge is that how all of our sacred texts, how we read them, because most of them are written in a particular time and context. Whether it is from the biblical world, whether it is from the Quran, whether it is from any sacred text, but how the rereading of our sacred texts from particular aspects, from particular lenses today, opens up a whole other understanding. And I'd like to know if other people find that when they bring to reading to their sacred texts, some of the challenges that they may find, or how they were interpreted to them as maybe younger people, or in a particular time of a faith tradition, and whether they maybe have moved on from that. So it doesn't matter, it's where your sacred text comes out of, it's how the lenses and how other scholars may have helped broaden and change the perspective to which a text was seen in a particular way. Because in this text that I use, most people don't like to see Jesus as harsh words. They don't see the woman as protagonist for change, and they don't think that Jesus was entrapped in his own culture biased particular perspective. It wouldn't have been read in that way. So that would be the question I'd have if anybody else has similar experiences of reading text from a very different perspective.
I mean, is this another way to frame that question? Could it be, how has your relationship with sacred text migrated?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that particular text has always been one that I found troubling until I came across a reading like the one you're given. Because in a sense, you were presented with, as you say, a challenge in terms of your perception of who Jesus is meant to be, and then, as you say, a representation of an encounter in which he seemed to be dismissive and was dismissive and harsh. So until I came across that reading, I found it troubling. So so there was a journey, I think. How that works in other sacred texts, I don't know, but I think that's something that I've learned to value in our approach to the text, that it is a source of not always comfort, or not always, it's something that, like migrants experience, the difference makes you move to a different place. I mean, internally to a different place.
Any other responses on the migration of sacred text?
I think Swami is asking to come in there. If you just unmute yourself, Swami.
Well, I mean, I think the scriptural text that you quoted there, Sheila, is actually probably more dramatic than many people think, because I think it's the book of Joshua, isn't it, that actually exhorts the complete annihilation of the Canaanite race. And I think there are broadly two dimensions to religion and interpretation of religious texts. And I think that religious leaders, prophets, incarnations, etc., would be keen to get to the spirit of a text rather than the letter. And I think it's remarkable that much of the issues to do with refugee situations and migrations has actually been caused by religions themselves.
Mm-hmm. And
that highlights then one interpretation of religions and a religious text that exhorts to disrupt somebody who is different on the one hand, and a kind of sense of unity, which is more deeply felt and understood in religion, that has as its elements compassion and deals with the situation of refugees and migrants and resolves that in the future, their own religion won't cause it.
Just to say that there's a message from Anna McHugh in the chat box, in case if people didn't see it. Beautiful interpretation, Sheila. This is your interpretation. I thought Jesus, being God, was all-knowing. I would not need to be taught something by the Canaanite woman.
Sheila, would you like to respond to that?
Yes, and I think that's the problem with how interpretations have been given, you know, and we believe that our scriptures are ever ancient and ever new, and that they can, when we take them anew, that, as it says even in Hebrews, that they can cut through like a double-edged sword, because the message sometimes gets lost, particularly in texts that we are familiar with, because we just hear the words and we don't really hear what exactly can be in the text. And I suppose to think of Jesus as a person who was born knowing everything, rather than a person who had to grow and change in knowledge and wisdom through his interactions and counter-interactions in the places that he was meeting and in the people who forced him to change. And some of them were women. And like whether you take the Canaanite woman or the Samaritan woman or other women in the biblical Second Testament, you'll see. So I think it's our way of believing that nothing changes in a faith tradition, or that things are stagnant rather than things move and change. And context, as I said before, context makes a difference. And I think, you know, we all speak out of our own contexts and very much our own experience. But it is when we are moved and challenged to change by others into other spaces and grow in wisdom and knowledge of, you know, being part of the Dublin City Interfaith Forum for me, because primarily my working world was primarily within the Christian world. Like I worked within Ireland, which was at my time, when I lived in the country prior to moving abroad, was predominantly Christian. And I worked in Latin America, which was seen as predominantly Christian. So it's only when you begin to work with others from different faiths that you realize the expansiveness, the change, how to, as you said, Lia, in the beginning, how you look at your own faith differently as well. So I think that's what migrants and refugees offer us, that ever expanding world, that ever challenge to look at our text differently. And we read into what might be there, and as Swami said, how they've been used politically to be barriers rather than places of liberation, things of control rather than things that are about God. So I think it is in our encounters with others, and it is in our discussions like these, that we help to grow in wisdom and knowledge and challenge our own mindsets and be like Jesus, to realize we're not all knowing. We don't all have it sewn up, and that it's the other who helps us expand our consciousness to who God created.
I think we have time to take one more comment or question on this theme of sacred text.
If I could come in maybe just with a very brief comment. I think at some point we've all been Jesus in our journey. I always like to quote Father Bobby Gilmore when he talks about migration. He speaks about migration as a journey of the heart and the soul. So no doubt we all came across at some point difficult difficult situations when we struggle with ourselves to move past certain barriers and past certain walls. The interfaith, I suppose, the interfaith platforms give us the space, a safe space where we can explore more and learn more. And through that process, we become more comfortable within our own convictions, within our own tradition, but also more comfortable with accepting other traditions and appreciating difference, learning from difference, but also what we have in common. Thank you.
I just noticed quickly, Dr. Puri wants to say something quickly.
Yeah, as Adrian has just now said, we have to look up in the differences of the others, but at the same time agree with the differences. There could be differences. We have to look for commonalities. When you look for commonalities, it brings a cohesion. When you look for differences, more differences, it causes a disaster usually and discrimination. Like in our holy scripture, Guru Granth Sahib, Guru Nanak, because at that time and frame, the woman was treated as of a lower status. So Guru Nanak said, you come out of the woman, you marry a woman, when one dies, you look for another woman. How the woman can be inferior? She is as superior because she is your first teacher. She has given birth to the king, to the saint, to the pauper. He said, everybody is his creation. We are all his children. We may have a different attire. We may have different things, but our DNA and all chromosome level, everybody has got the same. All five elements have been added up into the human body. They are all enemies of each other, water, the air, and the earth. But at the same time, they are living together. So whatever the progression has come, Guru Nanak said, live together as one family. This is all your family, which is equal, egalitarian, irrespective of the caste, creed, color, language. You know, you all are equal.
Thank you. That's a really beautiful way to wrap up this discussion on sacred text. And actually, it ties in really quickly to something that I just wanted to show you briefly before we move on to the next section. So thank you for setting that up. Sheila's chapter in particular, I think, spoke really well to the artist that I'd commissioned to illustrate sorry about this, it's hard to talk at the same time, to illustrate this theme of sacred text. So for this theme, the sacred text theme, I commissioned an artist named Jacqueline Nichols, who comes from an Orthodox Jewish background and lives in North London. And like Sheila, she's really interested in how women read text, in reclaiming the voices of women in texts that have been, where they've been excluded. So she has a daily practice of reading one page of the Talmud every single day. This is a book of sacred writing in the Jewish tradition. And then she actually handwrites it and then disrupts it somehow. And then out of that process creates a piece of art. So for the book, which you can read more about in her chapter, which is really beautiful, she talks about her experience of being an artist from a traditional Orthodox background and using her art to question the theologies around that, and really to find her place in this very traditional Orthodox framework. It's a lovely chapter. It's a really lovely set of drawings that she contributed, and I think it resonates so clearly with everything that we've been talking about, both about the need to re-engage with text, but also the need to find the commonalities as well. Moving swiftly on, I'd like to finish by reflecting on the theme of diaspora and telling you a bit about the artist Issam Corbage, whom I had commissioned to provide some visual reflection for this third theme of the book. Issam is an artist from Syria. He trained in fine art, architecture, and theater design. He currently lives and teaches at Cambridge, at Cambridge University. And since 2011, he's really put a lot of his both artistic and political energy into responding to the crisis in Syria. So for this book, he offered images from 4 different installations, and I wanted us to look at just one of these today. It's called Dark Water, Burning World. So as I did with Catherine's map, I'm going to read you first his description of the installation, and then an excerpt from the chapter, which is an interview that I conducted with him in Cambridge. So Issam writes, "This piece originated as a response to a small artifact from Syria, 2,500 years old, in the collection of the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge. A miniature model ship carries 3 goddesses. The minute I saw it, I saw my project immediately. The original piece is made of lead. I thought, lead in boats? It will sink. My first experiments were in lead, but that didn't last long. Then I noticed my bicycle mud guards. Mud, guard. Its function is to guard, but many of my fellow Syrians were not guarded by the dangerous flimsy boats made from cheap, poor quality rubber. They might as well have been made from lead. So I started making my artwork from mud guards and spent matches. Resin holds the matches upright, suggesting that in desperate times, people bond, hold, and support each other. Symbolically, I tackled the reality of colossal damage by burning these matches. The burnt parts might be read as a reflection on the trauma that women, children, and men carry with them." And then just a brief excerpt from the chapter that follows his description of the 4 installations. I asked Issam, "How do you hope that your 4 images will challenge or provoke the readers of this book to think differently about migration?" His reply, "Any form of art requires a speaker and a listener, a performer and an audience. So the responsibility is both mine and the viewers. Although my images are referencing Syria, I would like them to be universal rather than local. I would like them to be about something whose meaning we all struggle with. Home, where is it? Where to find it, in front of or behind our skin? Home is a very complex concept. I'm still searching for it. In my quest for home, I learned to respect the other. I am a palimpsest. Each layer is a trace of different cultures I lived in and people I connected with. We migrate for different reasons. We are curious beings. We need to see the unseen, so we travel the world in search for connection with unfamiliar lands and unfamiliar communities. We need to wander beyond our physical homes, but we always need a piece to remind us of it." Okay, I just invite one of you to just kick off with a response to what you've seen and heard while I pop some questions up in the chat space for you.
Can I just quickly say that the artwork in that is absolutely moving. All the artwork you've shown has really been very impressive and very moving. More reasons to get the hard copy of the book.
Okay, so as you can see, I put just a few questions up in this space. Are there any other responses that people would like to share before we look at maybe one of the questions? Well, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about that that second question, actually. What did the boats and the matches say to you about community?
Have they come into the chat?
I'm sorry, Lia, I can't see the questions anywhere.
Oh, can you not?
Put them up, or
shall I read them out to you?
Yeah, that'd be good.
yeah, if you don't mind, please.
Yeah,
Yeah.
not a bit. Okay, so I have 3 questions about the installation that you've just seen. The first is, How does this set of images speak to you in light of current news? Second question, what do the matches say to you about community? And thirdly, for you, what is the relationship between home and migration?
Well, I think it's a very poignant description of the current migration situation, and it shows very clearly the fragility of people who are embarking and the risks they are taking when they're attempting to cross the sea. The burning matches, it just shows how deep this suffering can be, and the pain. I think they show the pain that people can go through at difficult times, and how intense that may be. They're very, very powerful images.
I'm always struck whenever I see that that boat with the matches, just how densely they're packed. And Isam said something really, really striking about how people hold each other upright.
So there's also, I mean, matches are ambiguous. They're destructive, but there's also energy, and it's you know, people who get on those boats have that. As Adrian said, Bobby talked about the journey of the heart and that, but there's, you know, people who can get up and go have an amount of energy and whatever that they use up trying to get, and that's what a match does. You know, it's burning, it's bright, it's light, and it's consuming as well. And there is something about that migrant journey. It needs that, you know, it needs that energy. It needs that, and you know, it's often said that migrants who have managed to get themselves through that awful journey to make a new home often make great contributions to the society they end up living in, because they are people who have that resilience and that energy and that brightness. So the matches, for me, was an ambiguous sort of a thing. It's a light as well as a destructive thing.
One of the poets that I commissioned actually for that third section on diaspora is a wonderful young man from Syria named Amir Darwish. He's really you might have come across him. He's increasingly part of poetry festivals across the UK, certainly. But he actually did that journey first by boat and then came overland through Europe, spent time in Calais, and eventually made it to the UK, where he claimed asylum, and is just a tremendous human being. Really, I was humbled that he was so keen to be part of this project.
Think to the question of home, and for those of us that moved out of, you know, anywhere that was familiar, to live in a different country and culture, to, you know, leave your own family home, to, you know, especially I suppose on the island of Ireland, where migration was very much a feature of our lives. You know, it's in our poetry, it's in our song, it's in so much of what people refer to, you know, especially because of the famine, and then, you know, the whole colonization, the war, whatever, work, unemployment. But it changes the whole concept, at least in this country, about when people come looking for a home in this country. We were used looking for homes in other spaces. And what constructs a home as a place you live in, or a place where you claim your identity, because those of us who lived abroad and wanted to come back home to live again, you know, because we saw it as home, to those that come here looking for this place to be our home. And one of the things that often struck me since I came back to Ireland 6 years ago now, is how difficult it is for Ireland to accept people coming here to look to be at home, when we were so wanting to be at home in many parts of the world, you know, whether it was Australia, New Zealand, the US, England, you name it, Irish people went there, Canada, you name it, you know, and we claim like a St. Patrick's Day festival. We think it's great. They celebrate it all over the world. We think these things are really, you know, to be Irish, or, you know, Joe Biden will say that he has Irish roots, you know, or whatever. But it's a very different concept, you know, when people come to want to share your territory, your space, and the challenges that it proposes when you see the journey, the heartbreaking journey that people make, that's symbolized in the boats, you know. And sometimes I wonder, my question often in the way that with things that I work at is what helps people to see the other in a way, to embrace the other who's different to themselves as a gift, as a thing to help grow the diversity, to be welcomed, you know, diversity of faith, diversity of culture, diversity of expression, rather than a fear, a threat, a loss of identity. You know, all of those things that have, because it's very new for Ireland. We're not like, you know, Great Britain, you know, that had all those multicultural identities, while it's still a reality for the last, 25, 30 years, but it's still this a place that you would not have thought that hate speech would be something people would have experienced. We thought we were a welcoming country. We're not that welcoming, you know, all those things about what makes it home. What makes your home a place that other people want to share, and what makes you help others to be at home in that space. And I think it's a huge challenge today when, because most people leave, and those fragile images that you showed, the majority of people risk everything for seeking a better way of being. And as faith people, our challenge is how do we embrace that diversity and welcome and border breaking and all of that, to create home spaces, to create spaces of trust, friendship, mutuality, and diversity, and that.
These things take time, don't they?
Donald, I think, wants to come in. Need to unmute yourself, Donald.
Yes, thanks, Michael. Yeah, it just reminds me of what you were talking about, like people who you live overseas. It reminded me of the poem by T.S. Eliot. He says, "We shall not cease from our explorations, and the end of our exploring will be to arrive where we started and to know the place for the first time." And having lived most of my adult life, like some people here overseas, coming back to your own country, you see it for the first time. And you can sometimes see it through the lens then of the visitors, the people who come over here to live. And you can relate with them perhaps with more compassion, and because you've been in some ways in different situations, in similar situations that they encounter as a foreigner in strange places. Like I myself found I was living in, maybe Shimada-san is Japanese ancestry, and I was there for 6 years, and it's very different, and it changed. It's not that you find out about the other country, but you learn more about yourself when you are tested, and it's a great challenge for us to, because these people, visitors and the migrants, they are on a daily basis testing their own selves, and it's an opportunity for us to experience that dynamism of, because when we living in a comfortable, our own home, we get comfortable and we get lackadaisical and lazy sometimes. But around us, these visitors, these people who can give us a new spirit, a wonderful revitalization of ourselves.
Thank you.
That's all I wanted to say.
Could I just say something?
Yes, go ahead.
Just a few points. I feel this artist it's wonderful, you know, that he can overcome all at the adversity and the suffering that he's gone through and produced so much beautiful art. Just a second point, you know, the image of the boat, of course, is the Syrians on the Mediterranean, you know, but then it's also the Irish community, because, you know, I've been working with Syrian resettlement for a number of years now, for about 4 or 5 years. So I've met so many of them, and I find them just absolutely beautiful people, you know, considering what they have experienced, you know, that they can come to Ireland, and they also thrive and succeed so well in Ireland. And there's projects, you know, there are a lot of communities in Ireland that are helping. I'm involved in fundraising, in doing my walk for community projects. It's a government-led project, some of you may know it, but it's where a community hosts a Syrian family. So at the moment there's one happening in Navan in County Meath, and they have to raise, the group in the community have to raise a lot of money, like 10,000, in order to bring over a family. So at the moment they're trying to do that. So there's a lot of people here. We might hear the negative things, but there's a lot of goodwill and love in the communities, wanting to help people of migrant background and to try and give them a new life. But the images are striking and are, you know, just so upsetting, but people can overcome adversity. That's the message I get from his paintings.
That's wonderful, and I'm so grateful to you for doing all the work that you're doing with the resettlement scheme. We're going to move in a moment just to a more general discussion. But I was wondering if you'd like to hear one of the poems from that young man I was telling you about.
Yes.
Which actually jumps right out of what both Donal and Anna were saying just now. So again, this is by Amir Darwish, who is, I think a really up-and-coming poet. Again, he came from Syria and settled in the UK. Oh, I want to say about 10 years ago. He's about my age, with a young family now. So this is one of the 4 poems that he gave for the book. It's called "We Want to Live." We want to live on a margin of a forgotten camp. With pain, we want to live. With sadness, with agony, with traumas, we want to live. With or without food, we want to live. With thirst, with enemies or without them, we still want to live. Under a cut in a tent with every drop of rain at night, we want to live. We want to live at the long queues for clothes, we want to live. With every step we take towards the journey of death, we want to live. With every tree we pass, with every pride swallowed, we want to live. With or without our children, we want to live. With or without our parents, we want to live. We want to live simply because we love life. So that's one of 4 by him in the book. And also at the end of the session, I'm going to tell you about an archive online where you can find each of the poets reading their works. Yeah. But for now, what I'd like to do is just spend the last few minutes we have together just in a really general conversation. I know that there were some questions from earlier in the session that we didn't have a chance to pick up at that time. So this is really just about those questions, if you feel that they're still relevant, and also just any broader reflections about this project as a whole.
I think Swami had a question there a few minutes ago.
Well, it was more of a comment really on, and I fully agree with Donal, particularly what you said. I don't think it's possible really to fully appreciate the plight of a refugee unless one has been a refugee, or at the very minimum, unless you have met refugees, you know, as has been mentioned, and to really understand with a great deal of empathy the terrible loss and in some cases sense of hopelessness. On the other hand, a sense of hope that is so beautifully portrayed in that image with the boat and the matches and so on. We can even think of more recent events on the Canary Islands of boats, flimsy rubber dinghies capsizing and so on, and the plight of these refugees. And it's a very complex situation in the context of theology and the empathy that should go with it, to try and stand in the shoes of people who are in this plight. I am myself, I guess, I'm a refugee, and in my own country, about 3 million refugees have left, and I think we have to be mindful that in this day and age, we have more refugees than has ever happened ever in the history of human history. So I think these images are moving. I think your subject matter is moving and comprehensive, but that's all I really wanted to say, just to make a comment on it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rami. John.
Yes, thank you very much. I suppose it's more of a reflection, really, but listening to all of this and also linking back to the notion of maps, visual theology, what's been running through my mind has been an analogy with Melanie Klein's work on internalized objects, which can be good or bad. You internalize them, then you project them out. And it seems to me that both for migrants coming to a country and settling there, and for the community that's already there, the internalized object of home and what that means, whether that's a good object or a bad object, is quite determinative of the experience. I remember talking with a friend from overseas who's not a migrant, and saying that for me, my concept of Ireland is one, where I'd see migration, coming here to settle, is a great thing, a really positive thing. It makes the place much more interesting, more diverse. And his response was to ask why I hated myself. So my concept of home and my country is something that I'd internalized, and his concept of what home means, those are very, very different. And it's just a comment about how that notion of what internalization of home as an object that we have could be foregrounded and examined, interrogated, problematized, whatever. Thank you.
And actually, Islam in this chapter goes on to talk about precisely that, about how we need objects from home to ground us and to remind us. So what does it mean when you lose those objects, especially if you're fleeing?
I think the other challenge, is when we look at the root causes of, the way that when Somali said we have more migration, more refugees, both either displaced in their own countries or seeking refuge somewhere else because of war, because of climate change, because of economic deprivations. And our responsibility too, to be, especially in the luxury of living in the Western world, which benefited. And we have a lifestyle because of the backs of so many people who are now displaced today and whose resources we often plunder in order to have the standard of living that we have. And I think as faith people, it forces us to really look at, the pandemic has taught us that a pandemic migrates everywhere. It doesn't know borders or boundaries. And it has forced us all to look at how connected we really are. And even though when they talk about having a vaccine, and all the debate around where those vaccines may come out of or how reliable those vaccines may be, but unless the weakest link of us is safe, none of us are safe. And it's the same, when it comes to the migration. If we could see that, that it is when it forces us all to look at what is a quality standard of living? What does it mean to be a citizen of our global world? What does it mean to respect the environment to which we live in so that we safeguard it for the flourishing of all peoples and of all of life on the planet? Because we're plundering it at such a rate that islands are going to disappear, homelands disappear for people forever. War is over natural resources, whether it is about water, whether it is mining, whether it is, whatever. So the root causes to which, the effect, the visible effect of people and those fragile boats, or Alan Curry, I remember when I first saw the body of Alan Curry on notion and thinking this has to change. People have to change when they see this, but nothing really changes. So as faith people, we have to use our voices on the political fronts of looking for that higher value, for that value of that is beyond a party political broadcast, that's beyond a particle, thing, because people and our planet need vision, need, aspiration to things that are not the neoliberal economic world. And I think, people's life stories tell us that. The poem you just read, Lia said, we live because we love life, we seek anything to preserve, the life that is here. So I think that's the other challenge for us. It's the experiences of what has happened to people help us to formulate and participate in civil society, to raise our voices for values that are above the neoliberal market economy that is setting a different type of world,
My hope is that this book, again, as I said at the very beginning, it's just a starting point. It's just a very limited range of perspectives. But what I'm hoping is that it does start some of these much needed conversations. And I think for me, this was not going to be a book about refugees, so to speak, but I just very much wanted to ensure that those perspectives and that agenda was also very much part of this conversation. So what I'd like to do just in the last few minutes together is just point you to that resource I told you about. So one of the things that I was quite embarrassed that Adrian read that very long biography, which he found from my consulting website. But what he didn't mention is that I'm also based part-time at the University of Roehampton, where I am a senior researcher for a foundation that I'm going to tell you about. And I also serve as the associate chaplain of one of the colleges at the university. So it was under the auspices of my research role through the Susanna Wesley Foundation that I was able to get the funding and the time to do this book. It's a partnership of the University of Roehampton and the British Methodist Church that I used to work for, doing their diversity work. It's a community of scholarship, and really its aim is to equip faith communities and all of those who work in them and with them. It's a place of dialogue, innovation, and for me, this is the crucial bit. It's about theology that is practical. What does it mean to put your theology into action? Whatever your theology is, how do you make that real and lived in the world? So on the website, and I will email this to Michael as well, so don't feel like you have to write it down frantically at the moment. On the website, there is a designated space where we are just developing some resources that come out of this book. So one of the first things that we did ahead of the publication date in June was to get all of the poets to submit audio recordings or occasionally a video recording of themselves reading the poetry in the book. And it's really moving, actually, working with contemporary poets to be able to hear their words in their own voices. So I will send that link to Michael to forward to you. When you have a moment, please do go and explore the space. It's at its very early stages, but in addition to the poetry, as things go along, we will be developing some reflection guides. There will be some podcasts as well. So it's just going to be a resource that develops, and we hope that it's just one small way that the conversations of the book can have another forum, another format for taking life outside of the pages of the book. The book, the paperback copy is going to be released in a few weeks' time. The publisher will also give a 25% discount for copies that are purchased directly through their website. But obviously, you can purchase both the ebook and the paper copy through any number of distributors. All of the proceeds do go to the Helen Bamber Foundation, and I'm really thrilled that we've been able to develop an ongoing relationship, because their work speaks very clearly to a lot of the themes that both Sheila and many of the other contributors raise in their chapters. So I think that's it for me. Thank you very much for the warm welcome. It's lovely to return to Dublin, even virtually, for a couple of hours. And I at some point will be doing, when the skies reopen, in-person events as well. I know that the Cora Mila community in Belfast is going to have me speak. So who knows, maybe I'll find a way to come down to Dublin as well and meet some of you in 3 dimensions. But for the time being, really thank you. And I've very much enjoyed my time with you.
Thanks a million, Lia. Can I just say, I put my email address, getmos@gmail. So if people want to get any follow-up to this, just send that to me, and any links or any sharing, or as I said, I'll post this up on YouTube. Just to say myself, I found, you know, you often go to book launches and you're just excited to get the book, but I think this has left, I think, a lot of people with a lot of things to reflect on. I noticed Claire posting in about the whole notion of visual theology and how exciting that is. I think people have had a lot of things to ponder. So hopefully this will start off discussions, reflections, and so on further on. It also strikes me that one of the events we couldn't do this year is we run an event every year called Mask, which is an Irish word for mixing and whatever. It's a sort of a cultural festival, interfaith cultural festival, and we had one year very successful poetry readings, and it would be great if we're able to have Mask next year, that we get some of the poets that you mentioned, because I think it would be really, really strong for us to be able to have that. So that's something I think, Adrian, we can look forward to. If we can get ourselves into a better place by next summer in terms of travel and so on. But just to say from myself, just to say how wonderful I felt the presentation was this morning, and I'm really looking forward to seeing that book and seeing those images, as well as reading the wonderful text that you've all written as well. I found that a very worthwhile morning. Adrian, do you want to say anything about DCIF?
Well, Michael, I think you summed it up and wrapped it up very, very nicely. I just want to thank Lia for taking the time this morning and taking us through the contents of this book. Like you said, what we talked about today and the issues that were raised will stay with us for some time. What the work we do, and I'm hoping that we'll stay in touch with Lia and the foundation that she works with, because the work we do with the Interfaith Forum, it's an application of practical theology that she's talking about. So hopefully we'll establish a link, and it won't be just the time when she's coming to visit Corrymeela, which, by the way, Corrymeela was one of the first places where the Interfaith Forum went for a retreat. And I don't know if Lia is familiar with Dr. Inderjit Bogle, who is a former president of the Methodist Church in UK. That was the time when we worked together to establish the Interfaith Forum. So there are connections there that we can reignite and revive. So once again, Lia, thank you very much for taking us through this journey, through this book, and we look forward to stay in touch. I also want to thank everybody